My name is Grace, but in my village, everyone calls me Mama Grace. I live in a small hut at the edge of the village, where life has been nothing but a series of endless struggles. I have a son, Obinna. He's my only child, my everything, yet he hates me with a passion I cannot understand. Obinna has grown to despise me for one reason. I cannot tell him who his father is. To him, I am the reason for his shame, his poverty, and his misery. He calls me names. Names so cruel they make my heart shatter into pieces every time I hear them. But I cannot hate him. No matter how much pain he causes me, he is still my son, my only family. I carry the weight of his hatred in silence. Every morning, I rise before the sun, my weak body barely able to move. I fetch water from the stream, carrying a pot heavier than my strength allows. I till the dry soil in our little farm, planting crops that barely grow. I cook, clean, and mend his torn clothes, all while he looks at me with eyes full of disdain. Why do you even bother, Mama? He sneers one day as I kneel in the dirt, weeding the farm with my bare hands. You'll never amount to anything. Just like you've ruined my life, you've ruined your own. His words cut me like a knife, but I don't respond. Instead, I keep working, hoping that one day he will understand the truth. But when? And how? I ask myself this question every single day. The villagers, too, are no better. They whisper behind my back, calling me names I dare not repeat. Grace, the cursed woman, they say. She had a child out of wedlock and doesn't even know the father. I hear them laugh as I pass by with my firewood on my head, my knees wobbling under the weight. I want to scream, to defend myself, to tell them the truth. But I can't, not yet. The truth is too heavy for me to bear, and even heavier for Obinna to understand. Obinna wasn't always this way. When he was a little boy, he used to hug me tightly, telling me he loved me more than anything in the world. But everything changed when he turned 12. That was when the questions began. Mama, who is my father? He asked one evening as we sat outside, eating the small portion of yam I had managed to prepare. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I had always known this day would come, but I wasn't prepared. Your father, he's not here, I said quietly, avoiding his gaze. Where is he then? He demanded. Why don't I have a father like everyone else? I couldn't answer. Tears welled up in my eyes as I stared at my son, my only child, the boy who deserved so much more than the life I had given him. But instead of comforting him, my silence became the wall that pushed him away. From that day, Obinna changed. He no longer looked at me with love, but with anger and bitterness. He refused to help me with chores, and when I asked for his help, he would scoff and walk away. I'm not your slave, he said once when I begged him to fetch water from the stream. You should have thought about that before you decided to ruin my life. I cried that night. I cried so hard I thought my heart would stop beating. But the next morning, I got up and continued as if nothing had happened. What else could I do? I had to be strong, for him, even if he hated me. Life in the village was never easy, but Obinna's hatred made it unbearable. The other children laughed at him for not having a father, and he took out his frustration on me. He refused to eat the food I cooked, claiming it was tasteless. He tore the clothes I mended for him, saying they were useless rags. One day, he even destroyed the only photograph I had of my late mother, a picture I cherished more than anything else in the world. Mama, stop keeping useless things, he said coldly as he tore the picture into pieces. You're useless enough as it is. That night, I cried again. But this time, I didn't cry for myself. I cried for my son, for the boy who was so full of anger that he couldn't see how much I loved him. The villagers noticed the way Obinna treated me, but they did nothing to help. Instead, they mocked me. Grace, your own son doesn't respect you, they said. What kind of mother are you? Their words were like poison, seeping into my soul. But I held my head high, pretending their taunts didn't bother me. What else could I do? I was alone in this world, with no one to turn to. One day, as I was returning from the farm, carrying a basket of cassava on my head, I saw Obinna sitting with his friends near the village square. They were laughing and joking, but as soon as they saw me, their laughter stopped. There goes the useless woman, one of his friends said loudly, loud enough for me to hear. To my horror, Obinna laughed along with them. My knees buckled, and I nearly dropped the basket. I wanted to run to him, to ask him why he hated me so much. But I couldn't. Instead, I turned away and walked home, my heart heavier than the basket on my head. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Life continued, each day harder than the last. My health began to deteriorate, but I didn't tell anyone. Not even Obinna. I didn't want to burden him any more than I already had. But one evening, as I was washing his clothes by the stream, I collapsed. The world around me spun, and darkness consumed me. When I woke up, I found myself lying on a rough mat in our small hut. My head was pounding, and my body felt like it had been crushed under a mountain. I tried to sit up, but my arms were too weak to support me. Obinna stood by the door, his arms crossed and his face cold. He wasn't worried or scared. Instead, he looked irritated. "You fainted at the stream," he said flatly. "One of the villagers carried you home." I tried to speak, to thank him for being there, but before I could say anything, he cut me off. "You should stop pretending to be strong, Mama," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're not fooling anyone." My heart sank. Even in my weakest moment, my son's words pierced me like a knife. But I didn't let him see my pain. I simply nodded and lay back down, letting the silence fill the room. Over the next few days, I pushed myself harder, despite my failing health. The farm needed tending, the house needed cleaning, and Obinna needed food to eat. I couldn't afford to rest, no matter how much my body begged me to. But Obinna's hatred only grew. He refused to eat the meals I cooked, claiming they were disgusting. He stopped speaking to me altogether, except to throw insults my way. One evening, as I sat by the fire, sewing a tear in his shirt, he stormed into the hut, his face red with anger. "Why don't you just tell me the truth, Mama?" he shouted. "Who is my father? Why are you hiding it from me?" I froze, the needle trembling in my hand. The truth was a burden I had carried for years, a secret that had eaten away at my soul. But I couldn't tell him. "Not yet. Obinna, please," I said softly. "It's not as simple as you think." "Not as simple," he scoffed. "You've ruined my life, and you can't even give me a simple answer. You're a coward, Mama. A coward." He stormed out of the hut, slamming the door behind him. I sat there, staring at the torn shirt in my lap, tears streaming down my face. How could I tell him the truth when I knew it would destroy him? The villagers began to notice how frail I had become. My once strong body was now thin and weak, and my face was pale and sunken. But they didn't offer to help. Instead, they whispered behind my back, their words like poison in the air. "She's dying," they said, "and her son doesn't even care." Their words weren't far from the truth. Obinna barely noticed my declining health. He was too busy blaming me for everything wrong in his life. One day, as I was walking back from the market with a heavy basket on my head, I stumbled and fell. The basket toppled over, spilling its contents onto the dusty road. The villagers stared but did nothing. They simply walked past, shaking their heads. "Poor Grace," one woman said. "She brought this upon herself." As I lay there, struggling to gather the spilled food, I saw Obinna standing in the distance, watching me. For a moment, I thought he would come to help me, but instead he turned and walked away. That night, as I lay on my mat, my body aching and my heart heavy, I made a decision. I couldn't keep the truth from Obinna any longer. He deserved to know, even if it meant losing him forever. The next morning, I called him into the hut. He stood by the door, his arms crossed and his face cold, just as it had been the day I fainted. "Obinna, I need to tell you something," I said, my voice trembling. "It's about your father." His eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of hope in his expression. But it quickly faded, replaced by anger. "It's about time," he said. "Go on, Mama. Tell me." I took a deep breath, my hands shaking. "Your father. He was not a good man, Obinna. He hurt me in ways I cannot describe. He abandoned me when I needed him most." Obinna stared at me, his jaw clenched. "So that's it," he said. "You're blaming him? You're the one who ruined my life, Mama. Not him." Tears streamed down my face as I realized that no matter what I said, Obinna would never forgive me. The hatred in his heart was too strong, and the walls between us were too high. As the days turned into weeks, my health continued to decline. I could no longer work in the farm, and the little food we had began to run out. Obinna, still filled with anger, refused to help. He spent most of his time in the village, avoiding me as much as possible. One evening, as I lay on my mat, too weak to move, I heard him come into the hut. He didn't say anything, but I could feel his presence. "Obinna," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Please don't hate me." He didn't respond. Instead, he stood there for a moment before turning and walking away. The villagers began to talk more openly about my condition. They said I wouldn't last much longer, and they were right. I could feel the life draining out of me with each passing day. One morning, as the sun rose over the village, I called Obinna to my side. He came reluctantly, his face still filled with anger. "Obinna," I said, my voice weak and trembling. "I need you to know. I love you. I always have." He didn't respond. Instead, he stared at me, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "Please, my son," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Promise me you'll forgive me one day." He turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my pain. Days passed, and I grew weaker. I could barely move, let alone leave the hut. The villagers whispered that my time was near, but Obinna, he still avoided me. He spent his days wandering the village, and at night I heard him return, but he never came to my side. One evening, as the last rays of the sun filtered through the cracks in our hut, I called out his name with every ounce of strength I had left. "Obinna." For the first time in weeks, he answered. He stepped into the room, his face stern but wary. "What is it now, Mama?" I gestured for him to come closer, but he stayed by the door, arms crossed. I took a shaky breath. I had no strength to argue, no strength to beg. Instead, I whispered, "I want to tell you the full truth, before it's too late." He scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh, here we go again. Another excuse, another lie." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "This time, I will tell you everything." I stared at my son, the boy I had carried in my womb for 9 long months, the boy I had raised with my own hands, and the boy who now hated me with every fiber of his being. My heart ached, not for myself, but for him, for the pain I knew this truth would bring. "Your father," I began, tears streaming down my face, "was a man I trusted, a man I thought loved me." Obinna's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. "He was not from this village," I continued. "He came here as a traveler, a merchant. He was charming, kind, and full of promises. I was young, naive, and I fell in love." I paused, struggling to find the words to continue. My voice broke as I said, "But he betrayed me, Obinna. He left me with nothing but you in my womb. I searched for him, begged for answers, but he was gone. I was left to face the shame alone." Obinna's expression darkened. "So that's it?" he said, his voice filled with anger. "You let some stranger ruin your life and mine? And you expect me to feel sorry for you?" His words hit me like a slap, but I didn't react. I had no strength left to fight. "You don't understand," I said softly. "I kept searching for him because I wanted you to have a father. I wanted you to know where you came from. But when I found him," my voice cracked, and I closed my eyes, the memory too painful to bear. "When I found him," I continued, "he told me he wanted nothing to do with me or you. He said we were a mistake." Obinna's face hardened, but I saw a flicker of pain in his eyes. For the first time, he didn't interrupt. He stood there, silent, as I poured out the truth. "I stayed in this village because I had nowhere else to go," I said. "The villagers mocked me, shunned me, but I endured it all for you. Every insult, every struggle, every moment of pain. I endured it because I wanted you to have a chance at life." Tears streamed down my face, and my voice grew weaker with every word. "I know I failed you, Obinna. I know I couldn't give you the life you deserved. But I never stopped loving you. Not for a single moment." Obinna turned away, his shoulders tense. I saw his hands clench into fists, and for a moment, I thought he might leave. But then he spoke, his voice low and trembling. "You should have told me sooner," he said. "You should have trusted me." "I was afraid," I admitted. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid of seeing the pain in your eyes." He didn't respond, and the silence between us was heavy. I reached out a trembling hand, hoping he would take it, but he didn't move. "I love you, Obinna," I whispered. "No matter what, I will always love you." That night, I fell asleep with a heavy heart, unsure if Obinna would ever forgive me. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to change. He still avoided me, but I noticed small acts of kindness. He fetched water from the stream, brought food to the hut, and even repaired the roof when it started to leak. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me hope. One evening, as I lay on my mat, too weak to move, he sat beside me for the first time in years. He didn't say anything, but his presence was enough. "Thank you," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. But it was too late. My body had endured too much, and my strength was gone. One morning, as the sun rose over the village, I felt the life slipping away from me. I called Obinna to my side, my voice barely audible. My son, I said, my breath shallow. Promise me you will live a good life. Promise me you will forgive me. He knelt beside me, tears streaming down his face. For the first time, I saw the boy I had loved so fiercely, the boy I had sacrificed everything for. I'm sorry, Mama, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I smiled, my heart finally at peace. I love you, Obinna. Always. And with those words, I closed my eyes, knowing I had done all I could. The villagers say they heard Obinna's cries echoing through the village that day. They say he wept for hours, clutching my lifeless body, begging for forgiveness. From that day on, he changed. He carried my memory in his heart, and he lived a life that would have made me proud. But the pain of losing me, of realizing too late how much I had loved him, stayed with him forever.